IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. Today we have with us a very special guest, Professor T.V. Paul, political scientist at McGill University, Canada. And I also have with me Manoj, the China dude. And we're going to discuss the idea of soft balancing and the options countries have in their relationship with China. But before we start, we'll go in for a short commercial break.
Do you wish you were smarter? Well, so do we. But the next best thing?
We could make you sound smarter.
And to help you with this endeavor, we are Simplified, a podcast that attempts to break down the complex world around you with a little knowledge, a lot of poor jokes, and a ton of random trivia.
Episodes out every Monday.
On the IVM podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts.
See ya!
All right, welcome back. Professor Paul, let me just start with a basic question for our viewers. What is soft balancing and how is it different from, say, hard balancing?
Yes. So the idea began in the series of articles in International Security Journal after the U.S. invasion of Iraq and in 2003. Why the United States did not receive a balancing coalition to prevent it from engaging in this aggressive warfare. Hard balancing theories would predict that when a threatening great power or power emerges, equilibrium is sometimes automatically created by those affected. But in the American case, it was not. So that produced quite a bit of argument back and forth, saying America is a different type of hegemon, different type of power. And I was one of the contributors to that original thinking. One of the criticism was that it was very much episodic, that it was all America-centric. But then I went and studied the subject and I realized that soft balancing has been going on since the concert of Europe, which is after the defeat of Napoleon, the great powers created a concert based on the idea that institutions can be used to restrain up to a point a great power or powers. So sometimes it is self-restraint, sometimes it is restrained by others. And that is my case study first, and then League of Nations was used by the Allied powers to restrain Japan and Italy, and arms control, naval arms control to restrain Japan. And even during the Cold War, the non-aligned movement was a kind of a limited soft balancing to restrain great power behavior, especially by countries like India. And so in the post-Cold War period, hard balancing became very difficult. Hard balancing relies on arms buildup and alliances, formal alliances, because the United States already is powerful, but the economic interdependence, nuclear weapons, alliances are fluid. The idea of this binary alliance system, the Cold War, came to an end. So different kinds of modes of behavior. And we don't have a theory to explain the strategic policies of different countries since the end of the Cold War. What I've noticed is what you call a mixture of strategies. Some are hedging, which basically insurance type of thing. Some are like, except for a few cases, hard balancing is not happening in the alliance formation. There is a lot of military buildup going on, but it's still not intense enough to balance whether the United States or China to some extent. So that's a puzzle, and that's led to this book. Soft balancing relies on institutions, limited alignments, ententes, economic instruments to restrain a potentially threatening state and its policies. Now, coming to China, this is a strategy along with hard balancing in some cases, especially America building up, but hardly any alliances against China that would have happened that we expected. There is a mixture of strategies that include limited hard balancing, India's case, not equal in terms of the Chinese buildup. China itself is not building sufficiently big enough to fight the Americans on a balancing plane. They haven't formed a formal alliance with Russia. There is a limited coalition. So why is that so? Why haven't they formed a military alliance? Because the threat is not that clear, and the Chinese are very clearly showing that their strategy is expansion but they are also using instruments that are non-traditional to some extent, or traditional if you want to call, for instance, the Belt and Road Initiative, which doesn't have a big military component to it, unlike, say, the East India Companies of yesteryears. And so, which may change. And so, for now, countries are benefiting and small states are using this opportunity in South Asia. We know Bangladesh and Nepal and all, trying to gain as much they can. And they are reluctant to form coalitions. So, balance of power, the traditional balance of power requires weaker states to form military coalitions. And that's not happening. That's why it is a soft balancing world, but it could change as China becomes more powerful or more threatening.
Right. So I just want to again go back to a very basic idea. You talked about the case studies, Concert of Europe, League of Nations, Non-Aligned Movement. Why did these efforts work for some time and why did they fail?
That's a very good question. That question, by the way, applies to hard balancing too. There's a myth that hard balancing always works. No, hard balancing failed miserably in Europe, and the explanation is underbalancing was the reason. So hard balancing in the Cold War period worked to some extent to prevent a major war, because the instrument of weapon of the time was nuclear weapons. So deterrence and balancing is connected. But it was not a peaceful period. It was a period of proxy wars. Some 40 million people in the developing world perished in this so-called great power peaceful period. So same with soft balancing. Soft balancing is like economic sanctions. You apply that as because you don't have many other choices. You do something or do nothing. And you have to do something. And in this case, soft balancing is sort of this default option you have, because it's a very good option if you are looking at keeping your relationship with the opponent, the possibly change, you can change later. Once you create a military alliance, that is very difficult to become friendly. So you can trade with China, you can engage China. At the same time, you can also have a soft balancing coalition if China does something wrong. So it gives more options. And historically, it hasn't been always successful or it hasn't been always good. So the nationalism in Italy, for instance, Italy's Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia produced the League response. And Mussolini used that to promote Italian fascism, telling the people that the world doesn't want us to be the next Roman Empire. He wanted, and the average Italian believed that Mussolini would bring that. Japan, the same thing. The whole naval arms control regime was used by the militaries, saying that the Western countries don't want Japan to become a great power. And then the whole league again in the Manchurian incidents and things like that came up with all these resolutions, which hawkish groups argued that we need to break all these institutional restraints. And Japan pulling out of the league was an example of that. So if the country is very aggressive, the target is very much revisionist power, any institutional restraint can be used by the revisionist states, authoritarian leaders, for mobilization. Hard balancing can also be used. So both these are instruments for statecraft up to a point, but doesn't mean that they are always successful, and we shouldn't put all our eggs into one strategy. So look at India. India is pursuing multiple strategies to deal with China. There is engagement, there is some limited hard balancing, there is soft balancing with Japan, with the Quad idea, United States, etc. But it hasn't formed a military alliance, as far as I know, with the United States, because we need also to trade with China. So these options are much more wider for a country like India dealing with a powerful China, because you don't want to completely isolate the Chinese. They have certain cards they can play that can undermine India's security. So political elite in that case has done quite well, but the Chinese, as we were discussing previously, have a tendency to push 2 steps forward and then 1 step backward, and so at the end they will come out as winner in some case. But my own sense is that the states in Asia Pacific are cautious of China's strategy and possibilities that China could emerge as a threat to them. Not for now, but at the same time, they are not completely closing the idea of hard balancing if at all is needed.
If you look at sort of some of the states in the broader sort of East Asian region, the Philippines has sort of changed in terms of after the electoral change with Duterte coming to power. And it appears that at least his administration wants to bandwagon as opposed to balance. Likewise, again, Cambodia and Laos haven't changed particularly, but there is greater bandwagoning there. So is this sort of change, is the idea of balancing, while say Singaporeans, the Indonesians, Vietnam, there are different variations of balancing that they are pursuing. Yet there are certain states that are bandwagoning. From a Chinese point of view, would you think that the idea of getting more states to bandwagon with you through BRI and investments and economic instruments, would that be a smarter strategy as opposed to or would that be mixed with instruments such as, say, militarization of South China Sea, which creates this mix of coercion and incentives, and therefore you get states to work with you?
A good point. Yeah, but historically, bandwagoning is you join the aggressor to get the spoils. So Hitler, some countries he thought would join. But historically, as Stephen Walt has argued, bandwagoning is a very rare phenomenon. Okay, maybe in imperial times, olden times, you go with because countries still want to survive. Even if they join for temporary purposes, they realize that they can be the targets of allied attacks. You will become part of the coalition. So bandwagoning has happened in both world wars and periods. But it is that nowadays that traditional military bandwagoning is not happening. What is happening is a kind of appeasement. You don't do much about what the Chinese are doing or support them diplomatically in ASEAN forums or other forums. And so we are loosely using that word, bandwagoning. In military sense, it is very much joining the aggressor to get some benefits out of it. So whether the Chinese have played that card, but what is interesting is domestic coalitions in these countries change. Look at what Maldives has done. So because if the Chinese play this card too strongly, domestic parties will become opponents of that regime that played this bandwagoning, if you want to call it. And I have a feeling that this can happen even in the Philippines. Probably not Cambodia because they have very few other options. The Philippines is very connected to the Western or American system in diaspora, whatever. So this current regime there may be playing. But you read some of his statements and he sometimes come across, we are ready to fight wars. And he's a very just a talkative guy. I can't see a grand strategy in his behavior or his regime's behavior. After all, this is the same country that went to the International Tribunal and got a fantastic soft-balancing judgment telling that China has no right over this 9 dot line. Entire South China Sea does not belong to China. But they didn't pursue it. So soft-balancing was attempted through legal institutional means. And some people thought that was a great propaganda victory for the Philippines and the ASEAN countries. But the problem is these smaller countries are vulnerable because they have very little investment coming from the Western countries. So this is Sri Lanka's problem. Who is bringing money there? Hardly any Western country. They look for. In fact, when I was visiting, I asked the question: why aren't the Western countries not investing? And one of the Canadian diplomats said, our companies look for proper systems and some returns to take home. And we have labor laws. We have all kinds of things where the Chinese don't care. they have their own workers who come in and they are doing something. But there is an underlying fear even among the ordinary Sri Lankans you encounter that we may become a colony of sorts, So, and that fear is all over Asia Pacific. And therefore, as long as that fear is there and this nationalism that we have witnessed in the post-colonial period, especially after decolonization, that can be provoked again. This is not the imperial period or pre-colonial period where people didn't know what their rights are, So the Chinese had to play this much more carefully than they think. And I don't see a massive siding with China if there is a territorial conflict happening. There is sufficient counterpoints already existing in the Asia-Pacific world. And these small states have their soft balance. ASEAN, for instance, they meet with the Chinese. The Code of Conduct is an example. It doesn't mean the Chinese follow everything they sign up, but the point is they are attempting. And so the system hasn't led to a binary kind of Cold War style world yet. And because of economic interdependence too, it may not happen that quickly. And the Chinese realize that if they lose their economic power, they are still not comfortable, sure, what will happen to their military power or their ambition itself. So they put a lot of eggs into this economic interdependence. They are very smart. They're using a liberal idea for their expansion, which the Americans and the British all use, but along with military expansion. So the Chinese are slowly probably expanding militarily too, but I think very cautiously than one would expect in historical terms.
But is this expansion of power purely through economic means? Is China going to be satisfied with that? Or will that behavior change when it has acquired greater economic power?
Yeah, so if you read the Chinese history, and their approach has been the Tianxia, or what they call the tributary model. They don't mind these weaker states existing as long as they provide the suzerainty or the kind of thing, vassal state system. So they read their history as a successful history of this tributary model. Although if you read that model, there's a lot of questions. How many states were actually within that? Not too many, actually. David Kang has a book about this, but he exaggerates. In fact, I was talking to the historian. He said the period when they are talking about the tributary model's highest period was also a period where the Indic system was going on, the Arab system regime was going on, and even the Mongol system was going on. It's not Chinese alone, and their control was confined to Korea and sometimes Vietnam, but not even Vietnam, Myanmar, parts of it. So Japan didn't join that part. And so, unless you include all of the other states of, ancient China or the medieval China, basically. So there's a lot of propaganda and claim about this tributary model. But it provides them a certain kind of strategic option, which is the smaller states, as long as you don't question us on our core interest or regime, you can survive, we will give you some goodies. And some states may not mind that. In any case, there is no sovereign equality. We consider Westphalian sovereignty as equality as something in people's head, really, basically. Because the powerful still dictate sometimes. They give the impression that's the impression that the Western countries gave to the weaker states, that you are also equal. But Chinese are doing it a different way. Sometimes not interfering in internal affairs, as long as you don't pose any challenge to Chinese order. And so order building from the Chinese point of view may be different from the Western order building. And if it can survive that order and America precipitously decline, which is a big if. America has been reinventing, and whether that 15-year gap in high-tech and weaponry, in certain kind of economic dynamism that American corporations show, that can be bridged, then China has much greater potential. But whatever it is, the size of the economy, that is, ancient China has 18th century, it was 36% of the global trade GDP of the world. India means larger South Asia, was 26%. So that can happen again. And then at that point, the Western countries will still be powerful. America can be powerful, but you can have a multipolar world order. But within Asia Pacific, with China being the leading economic power. And so that system may continue for a period of time. You have periods of relative calm in international history. It's not even Chinese history, So it's not automatic that we have this conflict spiral immediately happening. But then domestic politics plays a big role. We don't know the next Xi Jinping or who will be the person wanting to achieve hegemony quickly. Hitler's greatest dream was, achieve German hegemony before he dies. So that's a problem for some of these leaders. They don't want to leave it to next generation.
All right. And you talked about Korea, Vietnam. what are the options for these smaller countries? How do they soft balance against China?
So what you notice is that some of them are very agile in their strategies. They definitely are playing institutional balancing a lot. Institutions are a big part of their, like ASEAN countries. They are also building limited capabilities. They are keeping their option. They thought India would be a sub-balancing partner, and some of them still think Singapore in particular. Japan, I think, is also. So it's hedging is what is going on mostly. Hedging your bets, insurance policy, not put all your eggs in one basket. Don't become coalition partner of anybody unless you're already an alliance like Japan, US, or Korea, US. And to have a trade relationship with China, which helps them to have also some influence in Beijing. If they are not completely out of the Chinese trading system, then they will not have any say in that. So they are using interdependence. They are also using economic engagement. They're using these annual summits. By the way, you notice how many summits are happening every year. 3, 4, I think Modi himself goes to, which is a big change. I mean, if these summits are useless, institutions are useless, why are they there? So that's a big question. And somebody said it is better to be there than outside. And at least you can talk to. So institutions are actually playing a role that some people think the institutions are all failures. No, institutions are valued as places where they can converse, also sometimes calm things down. I mean, look, after the Doklam, it's a threat of pulling out of BRICS meeting was one thing that they say is stop the crisis. I don't know the extent of its influence, but clearly that was a soft balancing effort by India, Modi in particular. So small states worry, but at the same time, they do have options. I mean, the United States is still there as a major military presence. And so if you look at a country like Singapore, they allow the Americans to come in and give a certain type of facilities. So they haven't completely forgotten the idea that their history is history. There is imperial conquest took place, Japan, for instance. And there is some amount of balancing by them, but not as active as one would expect. It is because they don't want quick enmities. And Cold War was probably a good learning lesson for countries. There's not much to gain by having a Cold War. And the Chinese are not that ideological. See, that's another big difference. Soviets were ideological. And the Chinese are not challenging the existence of countries. Whereas during the Cold War, both sides thought they are questioning the existence of countries. So I have an argument in my books and articles that existential threat is important for any kind of hard balancing coalitions to emerge in the modern period in particular. Because even small states don't fear vanishing as they feared during the previous imperial era. So Germany and Japan would kill you as a state. Whereas China may try to dominate you, but may let you live. And that is a big change, the territorial integrity norm that has taken place in the contemporary world.
Okay. Is there evidence that different types of regimes choose different types of balancing? Would a warrior state choose soft balancing or hard balancing?
Depends what kind of threats they have. So take India, Pakistan. The Pakistanis fear existential threat from India, okay? Whether it is true or not, because they were cut into pieces by the Bangladesh experience. So if you ask a Pakistani general, what's your fear of India, they might do that again, that they will try that in Balochistan or where. So that's why their nuclear deterrent, they put a lot of premium, that if we don't have it, what would prevent India from cutting us into size again? So that's an existential fear. So that's the highest level of reason when a country gets into this hard balancing. India doesn't fear existential threat from China, as far as I can say. There is border threat or economic threat. So that's partly why India doesn't feel the need for creating an intense balance of power coalition vis-a-vis China. Even other South Asian states in other than Pakistan, don't feel existential threat from India, even though some political parties may use that, because India wants hegemony but doesn't need to remove them as states. So that's an important dimension here. And so regime type, by the way, some regimes can play this kind of balance of power to gain some geopolitics more intense than others. Like Turkey's Erdogan is playing all kinds of geopolitics. Iran, so revolutionary states play geopolitics intensely than others because they fear existential threat. Iran faces existential threat. Existential threat in the sense the regimes fear their existence, they equate that with the nation's existence. So the North Korean regime equates their existence with the country's existence. So, and that's the deadly combination. And so you notice those kind of the most vulnerable as well as the most unpredictable states in today's world.
Do you see what's happening between the US and China and this? You've described Indo-Pacific as soft balancing. Do you see some of what's happening between the US and China in terms of trade and technology, and also on things like human rights increasingly, and coupled with the Indo-Pacific sort of strategy? Increasingly, we see sort of the Chinese leadership talk about things like, over the last 5 years particularly, about things like ideological threats from the West, and now with all of this sense of containment of China, which for the regime would essentially mean an existential sort of threat in some ways going forward, if this expands. Do you see that as a possibility? So we've been talking about China potentially posing an existential threat to others, which, like you've clearly said, people don't necessarily see that. But would the Chinese regime see an existential threat if this intensifies? Particularly military cooperation between the US and India, say.
Yeah, so the Chinese have the WED strategy. You probably know more about that. Basically, they don't want India and the US to form a hard balancing coalition. So whenever India makes any move, or US, you notice the Chinese try to talk some issues or try to appease by coming here and try to have a meeting with the prime minister or whatever. And so what is happening is the Chinese have been successful so far, and they will make some concessions like the current trade dispute. And they also have constituencies in these Western countries, trading corporations. And so whenever they realize that there's possibility for escalation, they also play domestic politics. And that card has been successful so far because, for instance, the soybean constituency in America, they come out on television and say they are supporters of Trump, but look what you did to us. So that game is fairly successfully played by China, and so they have mitigated this dangerous possibility for escalation. And you notice they also if they are pushed too hard, they make some concessions. Doesn't mean that they will completely give up, but they may return to that stage. And they appeal to the public, there's still sympathizers of China in some of these countries. And some places like Australia and New Zealand, they have been very actively playing the domestic politics, the electoral politics, supporting groups. And that sometimes provoke opposition to them. And one other thing they have done is creating a wedge within the Western coalition. For instance, Italy. Apparently, Italy has joined the BRI.
Yes.
And even the European Union, they make their move in such a way that there's no real European coalition against China, except maybe for 5G at some extent. So look at the United States is not getting the help or support it thought it would get. But more interesting, the United States itself is playing different games because of the economic power of China. And there is a domestic politics angle too, because Trump realized that this trade thing is helping his domestic agenda or his support base. Now the stock market is booming because he's going to sign this thing. And that will help him in his election because even those critical of his behavior, policies, might say that we don't know what the Democratic, Bernie Sanders will bring because the stock market is very critical for average person's pension plan, and the feeling of being, even though it's in paper, it makes you feel like you're rich. And so the domestic politics of China-US relations is very important. The Chinese know that. So they have certain strategies they have been playing successfully thus far. But as you said, countries can sometimes, the Chinese history, you have periods of this crazy periods. There was a navy at some point and then they killed the navy. And Mao's behavior during certain periods are counterintuitive, everything, the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution. So getting rid of that's greatest contribution of Deng Xiaoping, and that, pragmatism and ideological up to a point, but most important thing is the country has to become a great power. Something that India hasn't done yet enough. It's mostly still in the ideological world, the struggles, internal struggles going on. But I don't know. I think the Chinese probably are also very insecure. A rising power has to be insecure. You don't know how many people like you. You can be a donor, but the donors are not always liked or loved, no?
Yeah.
Especially if you come with a lot of conditionalities.
So one last question, Professor. Based on your assessment, can China rise peacefully?
It depends. That's a conditional answer. I think so far it's shown that its strategy has been effective to come up to a point. So it also depends what China wants. Is it a form of tributary system with, Silk Roads and trading and Chinese porcelain, going everywhere in the past? It happened. The Ottoman Empire was buying their silk and things like that. If they're happy with that, that's fine. That historical experience is there. They didn't expand beyond a point. First of all, they had counter challenges, from the barbarian so-called Mongols and others. So they had a history of this expansion, and then they themselves curtailed that expansion. So in the emerging world order, if they play the cards well that they have done, and not to militarize BRI quickly, or even form too many bases and all that, until, of course, America declines. There may not be big balancing coalition against them. But if they follow the East India Company model, that the European imperial powers, colonial powers, bringing a navy, then expand territorially within weaker states, then I don't know who will be threatened. So I think a lot will depend on China's strategy itself. And if Chinese ambitions become too expansive, things may go bad. And the other thing would be American politics. The Americans have this tendency or the expectation they will stay on as a powerful state as long as they can. And then the question is, who will win the next revolution in military affairs, especially outer space? If a weapon system or something developed that gives extraordinary power to one state and giving the option of offensive doctrines to re-emerge. Right now it's the defensive deterrent world, and then China could, or any state could become powerful. So a lot of countervailing forces exist for an aggressive Chinese expansion, and at the same time, history is a history of wars, and we may think so irrational. 1914, nobody thought war is so absolutely necessary. But somebody could say that, if we don't fight now, we may lose in the future, sort of the preventive motivation. That's always there. And a lot of irrationality too, by the way, the cognitive. So societies that you think are cognitively going smooth suddenly become nasty sometimes. So I don't see this Pinker argument that we are making a lot of peaceful progress. There are these ups and downs and sometimes miscalculations. We need to nurture institutions. We need to look at these softer techniques for peaceful change. And I think China is making some efforts, but there is a lot of suspicion. Their system is not open enough to give us the feel that they will be a nice country eternally.
Okay. Well, thanks, Professor. It would seem that while international relations have changed, they remain as complex as ever, if not more. I'd also recommend our listeners check out Professor Paul's books. We'll provide a link in the low bar. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manoj.
Thank you.
Enjoyable.
And thank you for joining us on All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Welcome to Peak Planet, a new podcast where we delve into the fallouts of the growth path that we and indeed much of the world has chosen. Sustainable growth is the buzzword. Until we nail that down, we need to ensure that we keep our population healthy and also have the resources for our increasingly urban lifestyles. I'm Karthik Ganesan, a researcher at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, a Delhi-based policy research institute where for almost a decade we've been trying to explain and change the use, reuse and misuse of our resources. In the first season of Peak Planet, we take up air pollution, public enemy number one and an invisible one at that. Increasingly, the most important risk factor for adverse health outcomes, air pollution has become the most unwanted byproduct of our aggressively growing economy. Over 4 episodes, we find out how prepared our systems are to deal with this crisis. You can catch the entire first season of Peak Planet out now on the IVM Podcasts app or website, or wherever you get your podcast from.
Hi guys, this is Ayushi.
And I am Ritasha.
And welcome to Agla Station Adulthood.
It's a fun podcast we've got going on, and we'd love for you to tune in and enjoy with us.
Join us as we stop at various stations and discuss different topics that seem to be bothering us and hopefully
Dating,
you as well.
relationships, beauty, just being an adult, lots of different things.
We don't have a great grip on it, but we've done okay so far.
Catch Agla Station Adulthood every Thursday on the IVM app, the IVM website, or wherever else you get your podcasts.